World History of Christianity, Chapter 9, Part 3, page 354. Much of the trouble in church-state relations was that the state was in most countries at least as disorganized as the church. Peru, for instance, had 6 constitutions and 8 presidents in a space of 10 years. The new governments were effectively moneyless. They also needed an ideology to sustain their regimes. One immediate source of money could be found by disappropriating the church, rich in some parts, such as Mexico, though poor enough in others. The ideology favored by the pensadores was almost inevitably the anti-clerical liberalism struggling in Southern Europe with absolutist monarchies and a reactionary church. Damaging as it could actually be for young states, an attack on the church could appear the gateway to liberty and modernization. The degree of confrontation, however, was by no means everywhere the same. In Peru, the dominant figure for a quarter century, from the 1840s to the 1860s, was President Ramon Castilla, a mestizo who showed remarkable pragmatism in pursuing a liberal agenda while managing to avoid a collision with the church. He was assisted in this by the accommodating attitude of successive archbishops of Lima. In Mexico, the reverse was the case. Its original constitution declared that the religion of the Mexican nation is and shall be perpetually the Catholic Apostolic Roman religion. The nation protests it with wise and just laws and prohibits the exercise, the nation protects it with wise and just laws and prohibits the exercise of any other. In reality, the Mexican state was far from protective. Government policy moved, if erratically and across various coups, toward the abolition of ecclesiastical legal privilege, the fuero, and the confiscation of ecclesiastical property, while church authority dug itself into an ever more intransigent position. The Archbishop of Mexico responded to the new 1857 Constitution, which abolished the fuero and arranged for the expropriation of church lands by denouncing not only these measures, but also freedom of assembly, press, and expression. The 3 Years' War began, in consequence, late in 1857. The conservatives were roundly defeated, and President Juarez proceeded to a still more aggressive program. The confiscation of all church wealth, the suppression of all monasteries, the complete separation of church and state, freedom of religion. Nowhere else in Latin America was the institutional and emotional gulf between the church and the Republican regime so sharp or so lasting, but almost everywhere the church's political influence and pastoral presence declined steadily throughout the 19th century. It stood aloof, rigid in its newly acquired ultramontanism, bemoaning both the secularism of the state and the superstition of its peasant followers. While its clergy was now being reinforced by recruits from several parts of Europe, this simply strengthened the commitment to Latinization and the clericalization of church life, a commitment in which there was no place to sympathize with the popular, highly synchronistic Catholicism of the rural masses. The rural population, however, did not lose its addiction to Christianity. On the contrary, antagonistic as it mostly felt towards the middle-class Creoles, now fully in control of government and ejecting it from lands it had held hitherto under the umbrella of royal protection, it could identify itself precisely as Catholic, in contrast to its oppressors, even though in many countries the church's hierarchy had effectively made its peace with the decreasingly liberal and increasingly dictatorial regimes which had become established almost everywhere by the latter years of the 19th century. They were at one in disgust for the preoccupations of the very poor. We can best detect something of those preoccupations, what was becoming in reality the characteristic Catholicism of Latin America, at moments of uprising and unrest, of which there were very many. Let us consider 3. Autosperia rising in Peru in 1885, the movement led by Antonio Conselheiro, crushed by the Brazilian army at Canudos in October 1897, and the Cristiada in Mexico in the 1920s. The Autosperia Rising, named after its leader, an illiterate but dignified local Indian official who had been ill-treated by the departmental prefect, provides a useful example of mentalite, just because it was in any terms so insignificant as a rising. It came at a moment when Peru, having lost its war with Chile, had particularly weak government. Its aims were little more than to protest against overtaxation and bad treatment. Peasant Christianity shaped its course, even somewhat holding it back, but it was not as such a religious movement. If the rebels wrecked a couple of small towns, they were restrained elsewhere precisely by religious ritual, such as the carrying of the monstrance with the Blessed Sacrament in procession, just as Atusperia and his force were entering Caraz. He knelt at once, as did his followers. Again, when the government forces arrived at the rebel center of Juarez, there was little resistance because everyone was celebrating the important local festival of the Lord of Solitude. It is clear that local priests who were genuinely close to the Indians, but no less anxious to avoid strife or revolution, could mediate effectively by ritual and sermon because they did in a way belong to both sides. Do you want to rule the land and be condemned to hell forever, or will you suffer on earth and enjoy heaven eternally? Otherworldly as their teaching was, the Indians did not dispute its objectivity, but it is clear too that the festivals and rituals of the year were central to Indian life, quite apart from the role of the clergy. Even an insurrection had to wait while the feast of the Lord of Solitude was celebrated. Canudos grew out of a more explicitly religious motivation. Antonio Vincent Mendes Maciel had been a shopkeeper and lawyer's clerk in the Brazilian Northeast. Abandoned by his wife, he became a beato, a holy man, a penitent pilgrim, walking for 20 years through the backlands, offering advice and spiritual support, so that he became known as Nosso Conselheiro, our counselor, though he always referred to himself as O Peregrino, the pilgrim. Some rural priests, impressed by his devoutness and influence, asked permission for the Conselheiro to preach in their churches. The archbishop's reaction was exactly the opposite and prohibited anyone from listening to his words. By that time, a considerable crowd followed Antonio around, consisting of landless peasants and ex-slaves. The majority of the population in many parts of the Northeast had been slaves, and their emancipation had only come in 1888. When the government announced that taxes would be raised, the Conselheiro denounced it and even ordered the crowds to tear down copies of the edict and burn them. Following this incident, he decided to lead his people to a remote and inaccessible wasteland, Canudos, where they settled in 1893. Soon more and more people were joining them, and Canudos flourished extraordinarily, growing in numbers in 4 years, from 4,000 to 25,000. The land was free, food was plentiful. Our agriculture and animal farming at Canudos had proved a great success. To the landowners, whose laborers were abandoning them to join the new community, and to the government, which saw it as a millennialist and revolutionary threat to order, all this was too dangerous to be allowed to continue. The army was ordered to crush it, but it took 4 expeditions before finally Canudos was destroyed on 5 October 1897, a date the Brazilian army still commemorates. the Conselliero's body lay dead in the ruins of his church. Victor Lanterneri has claimed that Antonio thought himself to be a Messiah, a savior of men, and the reincarnation of Christ. It seems a great misunderstanding of what was in fact a pretty orthodox expression of popular Catholicism. The Consigliere carried round with him a copy of the Missao Abbreviata, also a little book in which he wrote down his own sermons. Meditations for the most part on the sufferings of Jesus and Mary. He saw his mission as the following of Jesus, the proclamation of the law of God, and the denunciation of Republicans, Freemasons, Protestants, and other evil people who would burn in hell. This reflected exactly enough the preaching of many a Franciscan, the religion Catholic peasants had been taught in Brazil for centuries, if just a little archaic for the clergy of the 1890s. What was really insufferable was that it was being said by a layman and a poorly educated one, and that it was linked with satisfaction of the peasants' yearning to recover a land of their own. It was the combination of otherworldly pieties with this worldly liberation, if only the chance to cultivate together a rather arid stretch of land, which made it so dangerous in the eyes of both church and state. The 20th century. The Cristiada in Mexico was altogether a larger, more politically dangerous affair. Another wave of church-state confrontation had been building up since the Mexican Revolution of 1910, whose spirit was more consistently and aggressively anti-religious than that of any previous government in post-independence Latin America. When in the mid-1920s, President Calles began the systematic implementation of the anti-religious articles of the 1917 Constitution, the bishops declared an interdict. No religious service would be performed. Calles saw before him a feeble, discredited church only waiting for its coup de grace from the forces of modernity, theoretically anxious to liberate the peasant. What he discovered instead was the entire rural population of the highly concentrated Central Highlands in armed revolt. The first riots took place within days of the suspension of services on 31 July 1926. By the following January, the movement was general, and the nastiness of the army's attempts at suppression merely increased it. 3 years later, the government had effectively lost, unable to defeat a guerrilla army involving some 50,000 men fighting in detached units, 25 to 500 strong. Church authority was almost equally embarrassed. The clergy had little part in encouraging the rising. Only one bishop had openly defended it, and the Vatican wanted a diplomatic compromise. By June 1929, church and state were forced to come to an interim agreement. Religious services were resumed, and within weeks the war ended, as spontaneously as it had started. Viva Cristo Rey, the battle cry of the Indian peasantry, gave the war its name, the Cristiada. This, the largest of all Latin American rural uprisings, had no specific point other than a religious one, and it differentiated peasant Christianity from the clerical church almost as much as from the anti-religious state. The bishops had found their surest defenders among those whose Catholicism they trusted the least, mixed as they saw it with every kind of syncretism. In an important pastoral letter of 1916, the Archbishop and future Cardinal of Rio de Janeiro, D. Sebastião Leme, had described the poor as ignorant, superstitious, impertinent, and fanatic, but they were the people, effectively the only people, who could ensure by the sacrifice of their lives that Catholicism could not be cut out as a colonial survival from a modern Latin America. By then, the ecclesiastical revival had, however, begun. Perhaps it could be dated from 1872, when the Bishop of Recife in Brazil, Dom Vital Maria de Oliveira, was sent to prison for challenging the state's control of the church in regard to the administration of religious fraternities. It is significant that this should happen in Brazil, whose population was growing fast with immigration from Europe and which would soon become the leading state of Latin America. In the 20th century, the nub of church history tends to shift from a Mexico-Peru axis to a Brazil-Mexico one. But almost everywhere, religious history is profoundly affected by mass immigration, which for the first time placed the native Indian inhabitants in a minority in most countries. As towns were magnified, their slums and shanty lands came to replace the remote rural areas as the focal point of missionary zeal. Only Peru and Colombia would retain an Indian majority. They would retain, too, a strong but particularly conservative Catholicism. In 1899, Leo XIII convoked a plenary council of Latin American bishops in Rome. Ecclesiastically, this was the beginning of a new age in which Rome had come to realize the huge importance of this continent. Throughout the 19th century, the influence of the church had declined, though much of the 20th century it would increase. In this, of course, it reflected the fortunes of the church in Europe and of the papacy in particular. It was after 1920, in the pontificate of Pius XI, and then after the Second World War of Pius XII, that the renewal was most clear. Dioceses multiplied, priests from Europe, first chiefly from Spain and then from many other countries, moved to Latin America to cope with its shortage of clergy. New religious institutions, from Catholic universities to forms of Catholic action, proliferated. By 1960, the continent included 35% of the world's nominal Catholics, rather more than Europe. Where hardly a middle-class intellectual could be found in the late 19th century claiming to be a Catholic, by the 1950s there was a very considerable Catholic intelligentsia, especially in Brazil. A young Brazilian philosopher, Jackson de Figueiredo, 1891 through 1928, began the movement with his submission to the church in 1917 and subsequent founding of the Dom Vital Center as a focus for the Catholic intellectual life of the new urban laity, thus recalling the example of the bishop who had gone to prison 40 years earlier. In many ways, this revival fitted naturally with what was happening in society at large. Here, the fashionable agnostic liberalism of the 19th century, with its contempt for the colonial past, but lack of success in coping with that past's legacy, particularly the divide between white haves and non-white have-nots, was giving way to new forms of nationalism fed on a romantic Hispanismo, which went naturally enough with right-wing Catholicism and could be linked with dictatorial regimes in Portugal and Spain. But it was also giving way in places to a more pragmatic pursuit of democracy, fueled not only by the example of the Anglo-Saxon countries, but also by the rise of Christian democratic parties in Western Europe. By the end of Pius XI's pontificate in 1958, the sheer importance of the Latin American Church within world Catholicism was obvious. Brazil alone had no fewer than 3 cardinals. In 1955, the first General Conference of the Latin American bishops was held in Rio de Janeiro, during which a permanent council was founded to link them together. SILAM. This provided both a model, which other continents were later to follow, and a working instrument for mutual assistance, immensely strengthening the capacity of the Latin American Church to respond to problems in a self-fashioned way, a capacity which would prove its value once the Vatican Council was over. Undoubtedly, looked at from the perspective of the 1950s, the reshaping of the Church throughout the continent must have appeared a great success. Yet the measure of that success masked major weaknesses. The shortage of local priests had led to an invasion of foreigners, possible at a time when priestly vocations in Europe and North America were rather numerous. Yet this transfer of literally thousands of priests from one continent to another not only failed to resolve the Latin American shortage in numerical terms, but also produced the rather undesirable position that by 1960, 37% of the entire clergy consisted of foreigners. In Venezuela, they were over 60%. In Guatemala, almost 85%. The importation of foreigners seemed simply to be helping the church put off the real issue of reshaping its own ministry in viable local terms. In general, this period appears in retrospect somewhat uncreative, little more than an application of standard Roman attitudes with almost no attempt at adaptation or enculturation other than that of going along with local nationalisms. Above all, the basic social issue of the huge discrepancy in wealth between landowners and upper middle class townspeople upon the one hand, the peasantry and urban proletariat on the other, coupled with the extent to which the church as institution was tied to the former, remained hidden beneath the pursuit of fairly conventional pastoral objectives. These objectives were not seen as incompatible with exceedingly close links between many senior ecclesiastics and some of the most oppressive and dictatorial regimes in the world. All that would be challenged in the last stormy period of church history, beginning with the Second Vatican Council, 1962 through 65. Almost every one of the more novel stresses in the Council's teaching resonated in Latin America, perhaps more than in any other continent. Social justice, the vocation of the lay Christian, the enhanced value of the vernacular languages into which the liturgy was to be translated, the positive encouragement of pluralism, the duty to attend, especially to the poor, following John the 23rd's own phrase, the Church of the Poor, Iglesia de los Pobres. The immediate response to the Vatican Council of the Latin American Church can be best seen in three ways. First, the Second General Conference of Latin American Bishops held at Medellin, Colombia in 1968. Second, in the development of liberation theology. Third, in the growth of Christian-based communities, above all in Brazil. At Medellin, the church declared its preferential option for the poor, committed itself to the liturgical use of the vernacular, encouraged the laity to be more actively involved in church life, and set about a rethink of the idea of sin in terms less of personal guilt and more of the collective responsibility of society in creating unjust and oppressive structures. Never before had the church in America defined its role in a way so critical of the socio-political order as it had existed, essentially unchanged since the 16th century. By doing so, it opened the doors to a burgeoning theology of liberation and to the exploration of ways in which, given the huge shortage of priests, the laity, particularly among the poorest classes, could actually shoulder an active ecclesiastical role. The Theology of Liberation, the seminal text for the New Thinking, was published in Spanish by Gustavo Gutierrez, a Peruvian priest, in 1971, and in English 2 years later. Liberation theology was a combination of the excitement seething through the Catholic Church worldwide in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council, a widespread willingness among radically minded religious intellectuals to go along with much in Marxism, and the particular circumstances of both society and church in Latin America. The balance between rich and poor had never been worse. The progressive developmental policies characteristic of the Christian democratic parties in Chile and elsewhere in the post-Second World War years had proved inadequate to provide a remedy, particularly because they, like all previous governments, had failed to challenge the dominance of the hacendados, the great landowners. Latin America appeared ripe for revolution, and within the church there was considerable willingness to back change of a fairly revolutionary sort. The tradition of Las Casas was at last being reappropriated, both by the thousands of European and North American priests who had responded in the 1950s and 1960s to the frequent appeals for help, and by a generation of young Latin American priests of whom the intellectual cream had been sent for advanced studies to Europe, and especially to Louvain. At the time, the Catholic University felt to be most deeply imbued with the spirit of Vatican II. While liberation theology came in various forms, some of which made for greater use of Marxist terminology and analysis than did others, its central thrust derived from the insistence of the need to pursue social justice, to be found both in the conciliar documents, especially Gaudium et Spes, the massive constitution on the Church in the modern world, and in recent papal encyclicals. Both Pope John's Mater et Magistra and Pope Paul's Populorum Progressio. In the last analysis, the Marxist element was marginal, while the doctrinal position was in general more conservatively orthodox than that of many leading European theologians of the period. Linked with liberation theology was the pastoral strategy which came to be known as the base community. The shortage of priests almost everywhere had long made a parish community of the sort hitherto taken for granted in the European church an impossibility, except in certain middle-class urban areas. Clericalism and an absence of contact between priests and people blocked the creation of the kind of local liturgical community with an informed and active laity which Vatican II had proposed as the model. The underlying ecclesiastical barrier to the development of such a church was, as ever, refusal to accept a married priesthood. The base community was, at heart, conceived simply as a way of developing parish-type communities without resident priests, in general smaller in size and consisting entirely of active members. This could only come about through encouraging a new kind of lay leadership, and in shifting the religious center of inspiration away from the Mass and towards a reading of the Bible as productive both of group prayer and of social action. All this was closely akin to an approach long approved in Europe within movements such as the Young Christian Workers and Students founded by Canon and finally Cardin, and influential in Latin America, especially in the 1950s. The base community, not the university, was the true context for liberation theology, and provided the home for its greatest classic, Ernesto Cardinal's The Gospel in Solentinem. But it was easier both to develop and then to attack liberation theology at the academic level. Liberation theology might be found on the academic agenda of every Latin American country. The presence of base communities was a good deal more limited and depended far more than did liberation theology on the sustained encouragement of the local episcopate. It was above all in the northeast of Brazil that such encouragement was to be found, particularly through the leadership of Archbishop Helder Camara of Recife. It was from Recife, too, that came the most outstanding theorist of the practice of a new kind of popular education, Paulo Freire, and his philosophy of conscientization, as expressed most powerfully in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed of 1970, were at the heart of the whole movement of base communities. As liberation theology and base community developed in the course of the 1970s and early 1980s as a major challenge, both to the socio-political system of Latin America and to the way the church had long been run, they inevitably came up against steadily increasing resistance from the more conservative elements in both church and state, as well as from Rome. Archbishop Lopez Trujillo of Medellin came to represent this reaction. Colombia is one of the strongest but also most conservative Catholic churches in the continent. So it was somewhat ironic that the 1968 General Conference of Selam should have been held there. Trujillo became Selam's executive secretary, and a long struggle began to be waged, in which Rome intervened with increasing weight on the conservative side by condemning aspects of liberation theology and appointing new bishops unsympathetic to it. If Peru is the home of liberation theology, it is also the country with the world's largest proportion of Opus Dei bishops, and Opus Dei represents worldwide the integralism characteristic of traditional Iberian Catholicism at its most conservative. If liberation theology's supposed Marxist character was the generally asserted ground of objection, it is probable that what worried Rome considerably more was the undermining of clerical control of the church through the development of lay-led base communities. At the same time, political polarization worsened between left and right, with far more aggressive U.S. intervention in Latin American politics in the final period of the Cold War, and the general shift to the right in American policies in the Reagan era. On the one side, liberal or socialist governments were replaced by military dictatorships in Chile, Brazil, Argentina, and elsewhere. On the other hand, in Nicaragua, the Sandinista Revolution of 1979 brought about a socialist revolution in which radical priests were closely involved. Father Miguel Descoto was Minister of Foreign Relations and Ernesto Cardenal Minister of Culture. Rome demanded that both withdraw. In the confrontation which escalated across the continent throughout the 1980s, a large number of priests were murdered, from Archbishop Oscar Romero of San Salvador, shot while celebrating Mass in March 1980, to Father Ignacio Ellacuria and his 5 Jesuit academic colleagues with their housekeeper and her daughter in the same country 9 years later. If the Vatican had appeared close to total condemnation of liberation theology in an instruction of 1984, it pulled back quite considerably in a further instruction of 1986, together with a letter of John Paul II to the Brazilian Episcopate 9 April 1986, in which he recognized that liberation theology is not only timely, but useful and necessary. Meanwhile, the collapse of communism in Russia and the ending of the Cold War removed much of the American rationale for backing oppressive governments in Latin America, and there developed a political movement in many countries towards more centralist positions. Yet the 1990s saw sustained oppression of the peasant majority, particularly in the dominantly Indian lands, southern Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, Peru. Especially noteworthy is the rising of the Zapatistas in Chiapas, Las Casas, Old Diocese in southern Mexico, where the Indian rural population remains as ill-used as ever, but magnificently supported by Bishop Samuel Ruiz of San Cristobal de las Casas. It is strangely symbolic of the continuity in Latin American church history that it can end the 20th century with a bishop of Chiapas struggling for social justice, much as his predecessor did 4.5 centuries earlier. While the apparent unison and excitement of the years around Medellin could not be recovered within the wider church, and those committed to an effective renewal of the Las Casas tradition were back in a situation far closer to his own, they had not been extinguished, and they had, for the first time in the history of Catholicism, made Latin America into a place of leadership and theological construction. Nevertheless, the pastoral potential of the base communities had certainly not been generally realized. The majority of the bishops were by the 1990s opposed to any radical renewal of church structures, while the shortage of priests was growing worse than ever, and it was no longer possible to seek any large number of recruits in Europe or North America because they too were now experiencing an increasing shortage. Throughout the Christian history of Latin America, the gap between popular Catholicism and the ecclesiastical clerical system has been a decisive factor. The two were in part held together in the first centuries by the activities of the religious orders, Franciscans and Jesuits especially. From the time when the Jesuits were expelled, and then after independence, the other orders were increasingly discriminated against, or even in some countries expelled as well. The gap grew greater. It was made still worse by the ultramontanism of the late 19th century church. The basic meaning of the whole movement of ecclesiastical renewal, spreading from the 1950s through to the murder of Archbishop Romero in 1980, was an attempt to close the gap, to reincorporate popular Catholicism within the full recognized life of the Church, by a triple program of cultural and linguistic adaptation, the empowering of lay leadership, and the pursuit of social justice, which has always been impossible without agrarian reform. The reaction of the Church's leadership, as expressed in the figure of Archbishop Trujillo, inevitably threatened to prevent the closing of the gap in Catholic terms, and may well have contributed to the encouragement of a very different development, the sudden mass advance of Protestantism in a continent where hitherto it was so marginal that a brief history of this sort could not reasonably refer to it at all. There had been some sort of Protestantism in the Caribbean since the mid-17th century, when the English conquered Barbados and the Dutch conquered Curaçao. However, as both the English and the Dutch were great slave owners but not great missionaries, it made little impact. Moravians, Methodists, and Baptists eventually became active in Jamaica and elsewhere, but the Dutch in particular appeared happy enough to let their black slaves remain Catholics of a sort, restricting the delights of Protestantism to the purely white. The 19th century began with no Protestant presence whatsoever on the mainland, although Protestantism was widely admired by the liberal political elite, which came to power after independence because it was the religion of Latin America's new mentors, Britain and the United States. Yet the consequences were slight. British missionary societies were long unwilling to regard these countries as suitable targets for mission because they were seen as already Christian, while American societies, which mostly had no such qualms, only became widely active in the 20th century. 19th century Protestantism was almost entirely a matter of immigration, mostly into the south of the continent, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. The immigrants kept largely to themselves. The Welsh in Patagonia even continued to speak Welsh. In all, their numbers were not great. Even in the first half of the 20th century, this position was not substantially altered. Protestant numbers certainly grew. There was a great multiplication of denominations and more direct missionary activity derived from America, particularly from the Southern Bible Belt. National councils of churches began to be formed. Mexico and Puerto Rico in the 1920s, Brazil and Argentina in the 1930s, Peru, Chile, Ecuador in the 1940s, Colombia and Guatemala in the 1950s. In 1949, the first Latin American Evangelical Conference was held, perhaps significantly in Buenos Aires. Protestantism at that date still had its firmest base at the southern end of the continent. But the 1950s were to see the beginning of a great change. The long social and political crisis into which the continent was entering provided an opening for new forms of Protestantism, as much as for new forms of Catholicism. Moreover, Asia, traditionally the principal field of American missionaries, was now becoming a largely closed area. Evangelicals turned their eyes south, just as the American government turned its eyes in the same direction, anxious to ensure in the Cold War that communism did not get a foothold west of the Atlantic, or if it did, as in Cuba, that it was severely isolated. American Protestant missionaries undoubtedly entered into this large political strategy, at times unconsciously, at least occasionally in full collusion. As Latin America became polarized between conservative national security regimes, utterly opposed to social justice policies but backed by the United States, and radical, often Marxist-inspired movements seeking a fundamental reform of the social and economic structure but backed by the new wave of socially active Catholic clergy, it was natural that evangelicalism should frequently appear as aligned with the former side. Its gospel was one of individual salvation, personal achievement, a limitation of Christian teaching to the traditionally religious aspects of life. Its apoliticism was here, as elsewhere, attractive to the political right because it theoretically removed religion from any applicability to politics. This was particularly true of the latest wave of Pentecostalism, favored in consequence by dictators like Pinochet in Chile and Somoza in Nicaragua. Nevertheless, Latin American Protestantism by the 1960s was as fragmented theologically and politically as Catholicism. If, on the one side, newly arrived movements could appear ostentatiously anti-Catholic, anti-ecumenical, and anti-communist, many older churches were as aware of the necessity of relating the gospel to the social and cultural realities of the continent as Catholics, and some of the leading liberation theologians were in fact Protestants, such as the Argentinian Jose Miguel Bonino and the Uruguayan Emilio Castro. For them, the renewed Catholicism of Vatican II was seen no longer as an enemy, but rather as an ally. The huge growth of the Protestant community in these years, above all in Brazil, cannot possibly be put down to the mere importation of an American-style fundamentalist evangelicalism. When Castro became General Secretary of the World Council of Churches in 1985, that point was demonstrated clearly enough. The constituency he represented was an utterly different one. Nevertheless, there were areas of rapid growth where American influence was preponderant. Take Guatemala. Its Protestants formed about 2% of the population in 1960, but 35% by 1990. While they included many of the urban middle class, they also included a considerable proportion of the poor. The 12,000 population of the township of Almalonga, 99% Maya, was divided by 1988 into 52% Catholic, 48% Protestant. What produced this sea change? It is hardly a happy story. A progressive Christian Democrat government committed to agrarian reform was overthrown by a military coup in 1954, backed by the small Guatemalan landowning elite and the American government. From then, for 50 years, Guatemala was torn to pieces by revolutionary governments, military terrorism, and movements of popular insurrection. Tens of thousands of people were killed, hundreds of Indian towns and villages wiped out. At the height of the government offensive under President Rios Montt, 1982 to 83, little less than genocide of the Indian population was taking place. General Montt was a born-again neo-Pentecostal evangelical, a member of the California-based Church of the Word, El Verbo. At the same time as the country was torn to pieces and hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans took refuge in Mexico, a huge missionary offensive was launched from America, funded by Jimmy Swaggart, Pat Robertson, and other TV evangelists proclaiming a highly anti-communist and anti-Catholic gospel of biblical fundamentalism and prosperity. Meanwhile, numerous Catholic priests, organizers of base communities, and preachers of a message of social justice were hounded out of the country, and association with them seemed only to lead to the threat of military attack. Protestant broadcasting in Guatemala City amounted to some 5,900 minutes a week Catholic broadcasting just 300. Essentially, what happened in these years was a huge and concerted campaign to eradicate both traditional Maya culture and Catholic influence, especially modernizing Catholic influence, and replace both by the religious culture of the American Bible Belt. Faced with a calamitous political and economic situation, conversion to what appeared to be American values proved overwhelmingly attractive. Thousands of distinct churches resulted, most of them, at least initially, under strong American Pentecostalist media influence, but increasingly self-generating and offering a religious message remarkably like that of Catholic missionaries 300 years earlier. As Juan Cedillo, pastor of the quickly growing Prince of Peace Church in Nebaj, explained, many left the Catholic Church because of the trauma of war that taught them that man couldn't create heaven on earth. We found that the earthly battle doesn't change anything. We must accept the suffering of this world in order to be saved by Jesus Christ in the world to come. It may well be that religious life for a peasant inside a Pentecostal church was not so different from that inside a base community, except that the stress in preaching was more on the world to come, which he or she was used to from traditional Catholicism, rather than on the world here and now. But another important difference, not only in Guatemala but in Brazil and everywhere, was that an ordinary person could well become a pastor in the one but never a pastor in the other. The Pentecostal ministry multiplied while the Catholic clergy in most places was in decline. Generally speaking, Brazilians will be Catholics or vague spiritualists. They will never make good Protestants. So wrote a leading Brazilian intellectual in the 1950s. By the 1990s, such a judgment was no longer plausible. Over 20 million Brazilians were Protestants, some 15% of the nation. They constituted over half the entire Protestant population of Latin America, but in a number of other countries, Protestants were between 8 and 20%. Chile, Nicaragua, Puerto Rico, El Salvador, Panama, and Venezuela. Most of the growth was Pentecostalist. Almost everywhere it owed a great deal to North American influence, to situations of grave political unsettlement, and to the use of the mass media, combining the flair of TV evangelism with a message of economic advancement for the individual. It is too soon to decide how far this movement will go in the major countries of South America in altering their basic Christian character. The ecclesiastical history of the continent has up to this point demonstrated an extraordinary stability and public uniformity. The model of Iberian Catholicism, somewhat refashioned by 19th century ultramontanism, has never hitherto been challenged, interiorly or exteriorly, except for occasional buffetings from an anti-clerical state. Since 1960, it has been under attack from both directions. Catholic reformism, with its strength in the religious orders, in university departments, and in the base community movement, has challenged it from within. Protestantism, and especially Pentecostal Protestantism, has challenged it from without. Yet, paradoxically, the older established Protestantism is often deeply in sympathy with radical Catholicism, while the new Protestantism is often both politically and doctrinally oddly similar to traditional Catholicism. It could well be that the conservative Catholic hierarchy, reinforced so strongly in the pontificate of John Paul II by undermining the base community movement because of its seeming threat to the traditional pattern of clerical control, has in fact been throwing away the only instrument in which most countries it could hold the Protestant advance at bay, and do it precisely by both sanctioning and reinvigorating the popular Catholicism of the poor. If the religiosity of the masses cannot find a helpful opening there, it switches easily enough to a neo-Pentecostal form. The complexity of modern Latin American Protestantism is already vast, and it would be highly mistaken to think that its future as a whole could, for instance, be foretold in the light of the Guatemalan experience, significant as the latter must be, given that it has made of Guatemala a country almost as Protestant as it is Catholic. While Brazil continues to hold the prime role, both in regard to Catholic reform and in regard to Protestantization, the story of each country, religious as much as political, is its own. The Latin American may need no reminding, but the outsider does have to beware of homogenizing Brazil and Peru, Argentina and Colombia, Chile and Mexico. Each has had its own religious history, clear enough in the 19th century, and still more clear in the 20th. What is certain is that hitherto nowhere else in the world did the Catholic Church have so huge a field almost to itself. That this is no longer the case, and that the religious development of the next 30 years, from Mexico City to Buenos Aires, may quite strikingly determine the entire balance of the Christian world. This ends Chapter 9.